to start. Welcome to the Poetry Room, everybody. And for those of you online, welcome to you as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Want to make a little acknowledgement at the beginning of that. My name is Peter, and I handle the events here at City Lights, and we are very delighted to be celebrating tonight Femme Futures, an abolitionist ethics for transfeminist worlds. It's published by Pluto Press. And tonight's event is brought to you by Women's and Gender Studies Project Survive and the Labor and Community Studies programs at City College of San Francisco. Actually, go City College. Woo. How many of you have been to City College? Or yay. So it's an amazing institution. For those of you even online should know about it. There's a great history to it that goes back to freedom of speech days and much, much more, and labor history and so on and so forth. So an honor to be sponsored by them. And to have Nat Raha and Mijke van der Drift with us here tonight, celebrating this amazing new book, Building Upon Experiences of Transformation, Belonging, and Recovery from Harm and Trauma. So Femme Futures offers transfeminist contributions to movements for collective liberation. It envisions possible futures built upon working together collectively, engaging in mutual care, and promoting transfeminism as an abolitionist movement. Nat Raha is a poet, activist, scholar, and lecturer at Glasgow School of Art. She contributed to the collection Transgender Marxism. She has authored 4 books of poetry, numerous journals and journal articles, and her writing has been translated into 8 languages. Mijke van der Drift is a tutor at the Royal College of Art in London. Mijke's work on ethics has appeared in various formats in journals, performances, and sound pieces. Together, they co-edit Radical Transfeminist Zine. So we're going to be having a little Q&A at the end of this. So for those of you online, you may post your questions in the chat function. Those of you who are here, wait till I come to you with the microphone. Otherwise, the folks online are not going to be able to hear you. So join us in giving them a warm welcome. It is such an honor to have you with us. Welcome. Thank you.
I've trapped my own mic cable. Hey everyone. Hi. Thanks to City Lights for having us. Thanks to everyone in the room who made this happen. You know who you are. It's a real treat to be here with Femme Futures. Mijke?
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks James for all the work. So we wrote this book in the pandemic. I got a phone call after the first 2 weeks of the pandemic from Nat. And Nat was, hey, Mijke, I think this is going to take a while. Shall we finally write that book? I think we can do it in a year. And I was like, a year? That sounds good. Yeah, let's do it. And so 4 years later, the book is here. We are...
but it's better for it. It's better all the 4 for it. And I was going to say, so firstly, it's a real treat to be here in the Poetry Room in City Lights. If you see me getting distracted by the shelf on my right as I look at Mijke, that's because like literally all my favorite writers are on the shelf. And I can see them. So, and what did I want to say? Femme Futures, poetry. I'm already distracted. Oh yeah, no wait, I'm going to talk about the stand-up. That this is the second time that Mijke and I have done an event where we have no chair, and it kind of becomes, it has a stand-up effect. So, as in the stand-up comedy effect, it's like an audience with Mijke and Nat with no one intervening. And so we're going to give you some structure. We're going to talk for probably about 45 minutes. Is that right? Is that our aim? And after that, we'll open it up to a Q&A. We're going to talk a little bit, we'll give a little bit of an intro to the book. We'll read a section from the book and talk about some of the key concepts in the text. I think in talking about the genesis and the origin of the book, there was also this, on the one hand, this book kind of became something we didn't imagine it to be. I think we spent a lot of time thinking about, we've been in dialogue for like 10 years now, probably a bit longer. and working on a mixture of kind of political questions and philosophical questions. And we really tried to produce a book that's kind of in the middle of these things. So on the one hand, speaking very directly to some of the concerns we felt about the kind of trans political movement. Hi, come on in. And we're writing from the UK/European context, which, so whilst we specifically talk about those things in the book, we don't think of it as a book that's like just about Europe or just about the UK, because A, the philosophical thinking is much broader than that, and B, actually we've had this experience before where we come to America from Europe, and there's various political things that we've been facing since, especially I think a lot since 2010. That's when my politicization kind of came into effect, and some of the the structural readjustment, far right governments lurching further and further right, Brexit, all this kind of stuff, already threw up so many questions around the efficacy of thinking about trans rights, thinking about what we elsewhere call the limits of transliberalism. And next to that, rather than just having a critique of a rights framework, which I think our folks in queer and who are deep in queer and trans studies or activism know about, right? We know that it's like, oh, this nation states want to assimilate us, or capitalism wants to market us. Rather than just having a critique, we really wanted to try and articulate something that concrete, practical concepts through which we can try and live our abolitionist lives. And so much of that thinking emerges out of the kinds of collective organizing that we were trying to do in different spaces. So, sometimes, like, we met originally and we were part of a collective housing project that kind of failed. And then next to that, we, went and did different things. And so we were always in this mix of like, okay, you're in a collective, something happens, maybe it goes wrong, maybe it succeeds, maybe it works for a couple of years and then things move on or things shift. And in that, there was so much about practices, the ways we organize together, the problems that we face, and also the everything that coheres in between the kind of political work, right? So it's like, okay, we're in a trans healthcare collective trying to do these things, but then so much else also happens in our lives that's relevant for our lives in that space. So we really wanted to try and write a book that was thinking through some of these questions, bringing up some of the challenges that come out of this, but really also centrally about, okay, there are some ideas and some concepts that suggest ways that we can live and try and conduct our lives with each other. And I really mean this in like, with each other is really key, kind of in relation to each other, rather than just as individuals who have identities. And we wanted to try and articulate something a little bit different from some of the other queer texts that have also been really important and influential for us in our thinking and over, from the last 30 years or longer.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was what we found in academic work is that there's quite often it stops with the indication of limits and limiting conditions, and then there's this vague gesture, but there's not really an embrace of, hey, we can actually do something else. And that is why we started to work about ethics. Because ethics, and that is for us the heart of trans life, is not that we say no to something or indicate a limit, but we actually walk off and do something else. We make another form of life. And then looking back through our lives, like I started squatting in the early 90s, this was what we were trying to do in the squat movement. And then working in collectives. This is how we try to work in certain collectives. We do it in a different way. And then I'm a union organizer in the UK, and our union is run by trans and queer people mostly. So we were like organizing the union in a very different way than we saw like national union leaning down on us. And we have something like, we were already doing it, and that is what we want to write about. And then we put femme in the title, because one of the key things that we found we were living is that if we think about masculinity, it's quite often, like Sarah Schulman is such a good example of that, right? So Sarah Schulman says, like, you cut away everything that is not necessary and the form becomes just really, really, really clear. And I go like, wow, that is not how I live. That is not how we organize. That is not how we make art. And then so we started to talk about, we started to interview each other and talk to each other about like, so what is this femness? And what we found is that the femness is actually constantly the the extra that you pull in is the talking to each other and finding out where all the different perspectives lie, and then finding out how that relates to how we want to be in the world. And so that feminist that we put in the title is not a sort of a positionality as such. It is a way of approach where the relationality and the connection actually makes who you are. And for instance, as an example, if I want to change my gender nowadays, it's just a train ride. I start in London where I'm just not really femme enough. And then I come to Amsterdam and it's like, all right. And then I go to Berlin, it's already a bit too femme, you know? So it is a bit like changing gender is so situational. And quite often in identity, this is completely ignored, right? Because identity is this thing that you get from an institution when you're out of connection. And when you're institutionalized, then that identity becomes really the key identifier. Could ask everybody what they wanted. And then when we knew what they wanted, and the same is in our union, sometimes we choose one person, and sometimes we choose the other person, and sometimes we choose the next person. And then when it was your turn that we're going to do your thing, it is also a kind of a humbling thing that everybody is supporting that. But what we try to avoid in this, and it's maybe also quite an anarchist ethics that we propose, is that it's always the same person doing the same thing, right? So we always have to follow that thing. And I think that is kind of what we wanted to cut out. But what it also leads to is kind of a lot of friction. So maybe we should go to the reading.
Okay, cool. So nice. I was wondering how we're always like, what's the lead? What's the lead into the reading? So we're going to read a chunk of the first chapter. The first chapter is actually really the chapter where we sit and spend a lot of time writing about feminists. It's called They Would Plant the Rose Garden Themselves. And its subtitle is Femme Complicity and the Rewiring of the Sensuous. And in this reading, we decided we're going to focus on the bit that's about complicity because, sorry, I'm going to take my glasses off so I can no longer see you, but I can see the book. Because it's one of the kind of key terms we wanted to, key concepts, key ideas that we kind of spend a lot of time talking about in this book. It keeps weaving back through the different chapters. And it's partly thinking about, and other people might describe it as our implicatedness in the world. But so we're just going to read, we're going to read.
If you want to read along, we're on page 26.
And there might be some skipping. Just we'll indicate. Okay, complicity and friction in and between collectives. Across this book, we discuss how transfeminist approaches collectivity, or feminist approaches collectivity and its attendant problems. We focus on collectivity in juxtaposition to the term community. Community is used in many different ways, but we understand it to mean a social group where there is something that group members have in common, but one doesn't necessarily know everyone. Collectives, on the contrast, exist through direct relations between people. It is a term that emerges for us from left-wing organizing or the squat movement. Collectives are often horizontally organized, and working with frictions in collectives is a key part of learning to organize. This includes dealing with finding oneself, the problem, without lapsing into guilt, defending ignorance, or hoping for a world in which innocence is an option.
We think about complicity because we live in worlds in which we are interlinked in many ways, not all of them voluntary, consensual, or desired. We enter into worlds that are imposed on us, such as the economically hostile environment that forces us into jobs we might not want. In this world, we may need to display professional behavior that we do not consent to. For instance, to greet all customers with courtesy and a smile, while one is mistreated by their boss, or to participate in the professionalization of trans studies, or to be instructed to align with institutional demands that we cannot always stop. We might resist PREVENT screenings. PREVENT is a sort of counter-radicalization program in the UK. It's really racist. Or mandatory attendance monitoring for visas, but teachers still need to grade their students, even if from a pedagogical perspective, we find the practice irrelevant or even harmful. In doing the work of uprooting structures that enclose us in harmful ways, we need to attend to the way these structures find form within us and in our collectives. We do not undertake this work from a critical distance, but primarily through making different forms of life. Debarati Sanyal understands complicity as a structure of engagement that produces ethical and political reflection across proliferating frames of reference. We take engagement to mean the practice of making new forms of living, to make sure we are not forced into a single way of knowing the world. In these forms of living otherwise, we find pleasure and joy where we meet, love, have sex, organize, and make sense of what matters.
These different worlds, the hegemonic and those we fabricate with each other, are not cleanly separated, nor are the worlds we make for ourselves free from friction. While Kai Cheng Tom comments playfully and self-critically on, quote, the revolutionary over-enthusiasm of university queers, end quote, who want to go off with painted hair and raise unicorns on a collective farm, we don't question dreams of living apart from the contemporary world. The worlds we live in are made with shared references, different viewpoints, experiences, and also contain everyday frictions between each other, as well as dealing with normative duress. In the worlds we create collectively, we might find ourselves in situations where we are part of a problem or are a problem for someone else. Sometimes we are the problem for ourselves. And while resisting imposed worlds, we may find ourselves walked over by the bravado of comrades, or we might escape into a collective in which we enjoy ourselves, but that remains unreachable for others. It might be that our individual pleasures disrupt a collective. We often cannot solve the problems that are created by structures, and we might bring problems back home. This presents the issue. The issue of complicity presents itself in both institutional settings and in situations where we act collectively. So we need to think through complicity to deal with the many points of reference we bring to the table that we meet in our lives, and as a reminder to face what needs to be faced rather than ignore it.
Some collectives strive for purity by searching for the right rules or proper deference against at times generalized experiences of oppression as a way to cope with social complexities. The move towards decontextualized narrative happens because we cannot always share our personal experience with groups, or we cannot do so without collapsing into gestures of representation, where sometimes our individual experience represents the experience of those deemed to fit our category. But new norms of what constitutes a proper response to duress can be alienating. Because I am trans, my experiences are perhaps about trans until it appears that they don't fit the current style and rules of discussion. Experience-led organizing can collapse into an obligation to testify, and this testimony must be delivered in a recognizable and prescribed format.
Okay, I'm jumping to page 30 if you're following along. So the top of page 30. Dabatri Sanyal explains complicity as being folded into a situation, not standing on the sidelines, perhaps looking at the guilty one who transgressed the rules, perhaps shaming them, but rather a call to action and shared responsibility for a situation and how it might be changed. This combines with the attentiveness at the heart of our transfeminism, highlighting forms of care that not only attend to needs, reproduction or survival, but also to a reality to ensure that it is not curbed by discursive categories. Such attentiveness is saturated with the possibilities of exchange that occur in close proximity. Thinking about complicity helps us, on the one hand, to see positionality as a marker that determines the demands of hegemonic structures on our lives, and on the other hand, indicates how our becoming and our politics shape our understandings, our relations, relatability, and attention. Structural politics makes demands on how we share experiences, shed light on situations, and speak from our position. And sometimes this demands stasis, rather than allowing our insight to develop with others in diffuse and intermingled collectives. We work through how we appear and how others relate to us, and how power plays into this, including our own power and how we use it. Because some parts of our lives are not accessible to everyone. And when we meet people who have been shut out by the norm, we might find that we cannot hold space for everyone in each collective, or we find that our form of living is alienating to some. It might show how norms pop up inside collectives that shut some people out, and that the bonds that help make us through are and that the bonds that help make us through are experienced by some as obstacles, intentionally or unintentionally, or that our political struggles, the political struggles of our parents enable different lives for us or access to institutions, while this access can make us forget the solidarities and cultures forged through their struggles, through our parents' struggles. Thinking through complicity reminds us of the struggles of past generations to counter the normalization and depoliticization we have arrived at.
We also claim to be part of the problem because other people make us the problem. We bring social problems into situations where people scrutinize us, judge us, or feel the need to be very open to us in ways that are not always comfortable. It makes no sense to claim the problem is merely elsewhere and we are innocent of it. We might not be innocent. We might have prefigured responses to instances of what, for instance, appears to be transmisogyny that go beyond what the situation requires. We might have stores of anger ready to share or feel defeated before we really are. We might, in words, hear echoes that others do not. We are not exculpated of any given problem, or culpability is something that needs to be navigated.
However, there's a clear difference between people who are closed out by non-normative collectives, for instance by racism, and people who perhaps inadvertently close themselves off to certain perspectives, experiences of duress, or modes of solidarity. The claim to complicity functions very differently on each side of the break. Complicity in practices that push people out invites a different manner of reflection than complicity with those same practices when one is themselves closed out. Evoking Kai-Cheng Tom again, this does not mean that we side with a liberal vision which claims that the truth lies in the middle. Rather, in social justice work, we are collectively responsible for the way we interact, even if it means we cannot always solve the problems emerging directly in specific interactions. It means honoring the enormous amount of labor it takes to create trust in collectives. The hurt of being closed out of a place where one hoped to flourish and find companion is real, after all. Neoliberalism disrupts trusts in collectives, and a lack of relational skills can lead to breakdowns in communities. The sensuous is one space where friction can be circumvented, and we expand on this in this chapter. Friction indicates points where worlds do not overlap. Some members of a group may be aware that their needs are deviating from a particular collective, sometimes because of their overlaps with other groups, or since they come with different histories and needs.
There is no withdrawing into a form of life which allows us to avoid structural problems. The problems of trans life, from the interwoven pressures of racism, xenophobia, ableism, and misogyny, to mutual frictions caused by structural stress and precarity, inhibit simple ways of coping. This defies the frictionless, policy-based hopes of liberalism. To embrace complicity is to interrupt the space-making practices imposed by normative binary gendering. Binary norms pair transgression and agency with victimization and passivity. Due to the passive nature of the victim, or so the story goes, an external force is required to intervene and protect the innocent harmed one. Innocence introduces force, and force demands allegiance with power. This is why the performance of innocence is necessary. It is the renewal of the bond with institutionalized force. The entire model of individualization retains the structure that requires the existence of perpetrators, police, and judgments. Centering complicity as sociality, as conspiracy, dashes the liberal hope for a frictionless space of innocence. For liberals, such a space promotes adherence to a single order and creates the policing function of management. Hierarchy and control are required elements. introducing coercion for some and a smooth ride for those in charge. Stepping into the fray of social life requires embracing that we act, because actions make patterns, and that these patterns might need to be changed to create openness to difference rather than separability. To face that is to ask how we can show up for each other, and how do we make and facilitate spaces.
Cool.
Thanks. Do you already want to ask something at this stage, or shall we just rattle on? Because now we're going to talk about management. This is where the real thing comes.
Do you want to jump in? Because I think it's already beginning in the last section that you just, last paragraph you just.
So one of at some point it helps if you write a book that you pick an enemy, and kind of which enemy you pick sort of determines a bit the shape of the book. And one of the enemies we picked was clearly management, because usually management is the problem, but also because we teach in universities, even though it's art schools, but still, and people in universities, they're often trained to become managers, and that it comes a bit because of the structure of critical theory. I don't know if you noticed this. So critical theory, it asks you to indicate limits and limiting conditions, but what it then does, it makes you like float a bit above the situation and put yourselves a bit ahead of everybody else, because you are the one indicating the limits and the limiting conditions, right? So you're not part of the context anymore, and you're a bit ahead of everybody else. And so before you know, you're in this sort of diagonal relation to everybody else, just pointing out what they do wrong, like a fucking manager. And so when we say it's management, maybe we are management, right? So this is this whole point about thinking about complicity. So this is why we talk about engagement and embracing the friction, because when you become I'm coming a bit too close in the mic and a bit too enthusiastic. And recently I get into this prophetic fire and I start to talk against management. It's like I can't help it really.
You say recently, but the whole 4 years we worked on the book.
We were writing this in part. There's in Britain something called ACAS, and it is a mediation service between employers and employees in the workplace. And we were writing this while I was one of the union negotiators in this ACAS process. Like, getting all the stress out. It was amazing. We were also taking the state of the Netherlands to court for transgression of human rights. Not that I care about human rights, but it was great to take them to court. So it was very, very helpful. It gave the pandemic a sort of cachet, I would say. And so we picked management as our enemy, in part because this attitude became so clear from this critical perspectives that cannot embrace the trans perspective, where it is like, we are not here to condemn maleness or masculinity. Then that is a misunderstanding of what transfeminist is. We are here because we go and do something else. We might say no to that, but then you go and do something else. And that is the whole point. That is literally the point, because otherwise, why bother?
And can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
And then thinking about these questions of management, we were also thinking a lot about how we get managed, right? And I think this, I was specifically also writing from the context of Scotland, where the bar for trans rights got set so low, and then the bar fell. And so that's the summary of the last 7 years, and in the sense it was like, okay, so around us we had this kind of NGO drive to change how easy it is to legally change your gender, and meanwhile everyone's like, there's no healthcare and no one has any money. So we were kind of like, and then there's a whole, I'm not going to tell you the whole story about the government consultation processes, but the way that the Scottish government tried to forge a consensus, I guess, around the kinds of legal reforms they wanted for legal gender recognition, was also a process of managing political dissent from the trans and queer community. So it also turned into they had this 2.5 year, 3 year process where they're consulting us, and they get, some TERFs write in and say, oh, we don't want this. And it's like, and meanwhile, the trans people are like, maybe some of the things that you're trying to encode could also backfire. You know, like having a book of all the non-binary people, that could go wrong. You know, there have been other lists of people, of marginalized people that have backfired, right, or have been used in service of fascism, and so, you know, that's some of the thinking. And then next to this is like, on the other hand, we also see that in this, as this conversation rolls on, the queer and trans community around us don't really have a sense of what we're actually asking for when we're like, trans rights now, all these demonstrations. You know, it's kind of this multifaceted, was an overarching term that could describe multifaceted approaches to political change or political struggle. And some of those approaches have been coined by NGOs, and some of them have been led around by activists, especially around healthcare. And so we're kind of like, this is a weird muddy grammar where we've, on the one hand, kind of fallen into this like, oh, okay, we want trans rights, but we don't really know what we're actually talking about when we say that, because we don't specify it. And meanwhile, that's very easy to have a top-down approach, as was the way, to say, oh, we're going to do this thing that's good for you. We're going to look, you know, the government, like the Scottish government, it's like, we're going to look great. We're going to look like we really pro-trans people. And meanwhile, we just become pawns in this like actual struggle around Scottish autonomy and independence, right? And we get thrown under a bus because then the everything falls apart and nothing comes to the fore. And in that, you have a political vacuum where it's like management set up this game, and in the whole meanwhile of this is the intense ramping of xenophobia. And we're kind of like, there's no liberation in this space, because the intensity of xenophobia means that everyone has to check, you have to get your documents checked at every stage of public life, you know.
Shall I jump in? Because one of the things what we started to notice with politics of inclusion that had been going, because when we started to talk, right, like growing up in the 90s, it was really hard to find good radical theory. Really difficult. And now, I mean, Jesus Christ, we're in City Lights. I mean, you trip over the stuff. They've got a whole cellar full of their stuff. It's amazing.
They've got a section called Praxis.
They've got a section called Praxis. I couldn't believe it. I took a
sick.
photo of it and I could send it to my friends. But so what happened was that I found that I could teach literally any old thing I liked. So I could like teach against the government, against management, and everybody found it amazing. My students loved it. But at the same time, I found that I was losing more and more grip and control of the structure and the environment that we're living and working in. And that is what management was doing to us through inclusion. You could do any content you like, but you have no structure left to actually engage with. And so this is the point where we start to think through, like, how would a politics of solidarity based on friction, that embracing of friction, look like? What could it become when we don't want to be the management, right? Because it is not going to be better if we are the managers. You know, it is the position that creates the problem. So then we started to think about what is solidarity based on friction and what does it need? So if we say we're going to start a collective and we all have our wonderful, individual, beautiful thoughts and ideas, because all of us are extremely talented, I believe that, then we also, like, within 10 minutes before we're going to do something, like, we will be in an argument, and that's fantastic. And we started to think that through, like, but what if we want that? What does it ask from us? And then we found, actually, what it needs is we need to be generous to each other. And that is the start, rather than critical, what kind of lefty theory is often based on, indicating of limits and limiting conditions.
Beeline to edgelords.
Yeah, and all your actions are the expression of your structural position. Rather, we be generous and we say, like, yeah, you are the genius that you are. So we're just going to follow you for now. And then we follow you, and we follow you, and we follow you, and you, and you, and you online.
And which I guess brings us to this question. Well, it's not a question. It brings us back to abolition, and we think about, you know, thinking a lot about. Okay, so, you know, we have this idea of well, I mean, it comes out of Don Harry, right? If you're in San Francisco, of staying with the trouble, right? And next that is like, okay, so we know practically it's very easy to be like, sure, we're going to give everyone a space. Everyone's got a chance to, you know, we're going to follow all these things. But then we know it's going to be the mess. And next to that is, okay, so we're also saying, and we write about this in the book through this idea of separability, that the world is like capitalism is driving us to be more divided from each other, right? To have more social divisions, especially it's very easy for us to say this as the people who wrote the trans book, who are in the middle of the trans backlash, and obviously there's intense anti-immigrant backlash, intense repression of Palestine solidarity movements, right? And so in all of these things, it's like there's this ongoing drive of division, and we can think about different groups who've been targeted and in an attempt to remove people from the body politic or whatever of a nation state. And then we're like, okay, so it's true. We're all really good at this idea, this kind of abstract idea of practicing. No, not abstract. Let me say that again. We all have this sense of like, okay, so what does it mean to be in solidarity with marginalized people, right? Of whoever, be that like Muslims who are being targeted by the American government, be that people who are trying to enter Europe who are struggling to enter Fortress Europe. And sorry, I just hear it doesn't matter. And so next is like, cool, we have this sense, this affective, emotional sense of solidarity, but simultaneously we might get caught in the emotional resonances in our world are reproducing these social divisions, right? And that we're actually complicit in that. And then next that is like, okay, so we might also be in these spaces where we need solidarity and it doesn't seem to come. We're talking quite a bit in terms of making this trip, the number of times that people are like, oh, are you really going to America? Like now? Like, and they're like, are you not scared? And then being like, oh, actually it becomes this like, I don't want to call it concern trolling because it's not trolling, but the degree of concern's actually like, oh, this isn't actually very helpful because it doesn't give us any, you're just giving me your fear. And then I spend 3 days worried about your feelings. Because I'm an empath. And then meanwhile, I'm like, actually, what we need is you need somebody to be like, here are the practical skills that you need to travel safely in these moments, right? Here are some security protocols you might want to consider. And that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, there's a practice or a set of actions that are solidarinous in the sense of somebody can, I can turn around and say, here are the things that you need to do to be safe to cross this border. And sure, we can't predict what's going to happen at the border either. So let's not have a blanket prediction on everyone who's trans is going to get stopped at the border, because we also know that's not how transvisibility works either, or how any of this works, or how borders work or don't work. So it's like, actually, if we start thinking about what meaning, like where the meaning in solidarity can actually be manifest, be that in practices, be that through forms of protection, be that through through the things that we do socially, and sometimes that's reaching out, but that's also often about being willing and able to receive support. And like we said, we were writing this book during the COVID pandemic. We found so many times in the mutual aid upswing, where everyone's an anarchist suddenly, like true anarchism in the UK. And like, I'm not even an anarchist. It's like, turns out
I am.
But in that, the problem is like, cool, there's a lot of people who are really good at doing, who are willing and ready to offer their support, and offer their skills, offer their labor, put in their time, but they're not willing to receive support or time or attention from other people. And that ends up reproducing this like philanthropist approach of like, oh, I'm going to give you what I've got and I don't need anything. It's like, no, we're in a moment where our interrelations socially really matter, and that means that always goes in multiple directions. It's not even just a back and forth, it's going this way, right? Which is the kinds of collective social remaking that happened during COVID. And it's like, cool, I've got loads of time to help and sit and try and coordinate the new mutual aid infrastructure we're building, but I still need somebody to come and like, I still need somebody to come put up a shelf in my bedroom,
And so one of the things we noticed before we come to Q&A, so get your questions ready.
Yes.
Soon is your turn. So one of the things that we noticed is that inclusion politics that often work on the basis of identity, and then the notion of separability was very informative for this book, because this identity are sometimes used to keep us apart, because these people need that, these people need that. And we were thinking that through, and now, okay, I will come clean. I grew up on a farm. And in the city, it works in this way, but in the countryside, it doesn't really work in that way because there are not enough people in the countryside. So what you're going to do then is you want to grow lettuce, and then you sort of like put out the call, like, hey, people, I want to grow. Okay, so I didn't only grow up in the countryside. I grew up in a Bible Belt village. And I was an import Catholic. So, you have a certain pressure there. And then you put out still the call, I want to grow lettuce. And then, you don't only have the queers showing up, because there was a gay in the village. But then you have like a grandmother showing up, and then one of the younger people come up, and some of the older farmers who know everything better, and they do show up, and even a Protestant shows up. So, we're also dealing with that. And that is how country organizing works. You go on a practical activity, and you do it with a host of people that have actually, quote unquote, nothing to do with each other. And it's very different than urban organizing, which is so often organized per identity rather than per activity. This is what we're going to do, who wants to join. And then what you notice in this practical thing is that your identity becomes less and less important. And like this is written from within Britain, right? So one of the struggles that I learned a lot about, also from my childhood, because growing up in that Bible Belt village as minority Catholic, I really misunderstood the situation in Northern Ireland, and I thought we were quite close to war breaking out, but it was not so, because we were not occupied by the British, which is really helpful. But then when you look at the... sorry, Nat said it, it's like... is that if you look at Northern Ireland, one of the things that people started to do in the peace process is really undo the division between the communities. And it was always a working class uprising, but it's also a working class peace process, where people that don't come necessarily with theoretical or theory-driven approaches first, but building up from the knowledges that they build up also in the age blocks, to get together and to work together in order to move towards a space where they all want to live in. And I think that is quite often ignored in Britain, and yet it's a very informative process.
And to give another example on that note, and then we're going to open it to questions. I think this is again like one of the things that we find, I should say, and this is ongoing and continual, right? About knowledges is that often these are embodied, right? And then next to the drive to try and do autonomous organizing in our communities, right? And sure, there's plenty of good reasons to be doing autonomous organizing. One of the troubles is that when autonomous organizing is just autonomous and is just people of one type talking to each other, we miss the power of when we start doing coalition organizing across difference, right? And one of the things that comes up a little bit, we do write about this in the chapter we write about, or the chapter on healthcare, which is chapter 4 of the book, is that we start finding that in thinking about embodied knowledges, there's so much across difference that begins to manifest. So it's like, oh, it turns, and it's like, oh, it doesn't take much. It's like, actually, it turns out that trans femmes and the people who are going through menopause have loads in common to talk about around medication and healthcare. And then it's like, but we're continually kept apart and divided, right? Because there's and I see this a lot in the UK, there's so much exceptionalization around transness, to the point where trans healthcare is being policed because we're being exceptionalized. And the next slide was like, no, actually, if we start sharing and thinking through our knowledges, and sometimes that might actually be sharing medications, sure, we start to learn more about the similarities between our bodies and also being able to point out differences. And that's the like the nuance, or we can call it a dialectic, whatever, across both difference and similarity that kind of matters. And I think this is like such a key insight, and it's really clear in giving healthcare an example. You're talking about, the village coming together to work together. That in these moments, that's where knowledge don't want to say knowledge exchange, but where thinking through the practice, thinking through embodied knowledge, so not here, just like also here, right? And we really use the term body mind and think about the insole body mind in the book because we don't want to believe in this body mind split, and we think that's part of the problems that we're trying to unthink as part of a wider decolonial practice, right? But in the knowledge that's here and also here, right? That in that coming together, we learn something more about the kinds of practices that we can try and forge together. And when I say that, I keep thinking like there's so much potentiality to build a new kind of feminist healthcare struggle. And we don't argue that in the book per se, but I'm always like, that's one of the things that we really need in this moment of the backlash. So rather than getting stuck in the like, oh, here they've come for us and we haven't got anyone in solidarity, it's like, okay, sure, we're under attack. But simultaneously, that doesn't mean that's no reason for us to not say, hey, let's build a feminist healthcare coalition with all the disabled folks, all the people who want better HRT for everyone, better medication access, where it looks different in different countries, but in the UK, this is really key, right? And that's part of how we try and build new forms of power. And it's easier said than done. But actually, these are the things that really matter, and it requires us to think, to not get stuck in identitarian thinking and to think about the practices that we can share.
Great, thanks. On that note,
Yeah.
Hey, yes, you have a question. I'm going to give you the microphone, or you're going to give it.
Yeah, you can share that.
Great.
Cool. And you've got to speak into the mic so people online can hear us.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. It's really, really, really nice to have you here and to
Thanks for coming.
see you in person.
Tell us who you are also, so make it nice.
What?
Tell us who you are when you are. So
Oh, yes. I'm Anya Flower. I am one of the many co-authors of Transgender Marxism, which Nat is in. Are you also in it, Mijke?
Make us not a Marxist.
I'm not a Marxist. I came out in the 90s, and you had to choose between anarchism and Marxism, and I chose anarchism. Sorry.
Real talk.
Well, I'm one of the good Marxists.
It's
Please.
fine. We wrote this book. See, anything is possible. We co-wrote this book.
So I've been working a lot with mostly cisgender, in fact, quite a few old furry eyebrowed white male, Marxists and some anarchists for many years, and some of them have been great comrades and very supportive, and some of them have will just suddenly come out with just gobsmacking ignorance around trans stuff, or but something that has been a great struggle for me to do is to get people to engage systematically in thinking, but also in practice with working class trans people's struggles, which part of it is there isn't a built up habit, right? Leftists sort of know what to do more or less when it comes to a strike, or we have routines, functional or dysfunctional or otherwise, when it comes to working class black uprising. Those don't really exist around trans proletarians' life, except for the stuff that's been built up by the liberal complex of allyship, song and dance, and sort of HR nonsense, which is now coming under attack. So people really don't know what to do. So I end up with people who wouldn't do allyship politics in any other context or admit to doing tokenizing allyship politics, default to it anyway. And I, in the course of my own research, have ended up looking at stuff around the foundation of the nation state. John Locke's letter on toleration, which is where we get the tolerant stuff. Protestant versus Catholic, right? Trying to get the Protestants to be okay with the Catholics, so long as
No.
people understand that the Protestants are the citizens and the Catholics just get to practice without being killed for it. Right?
In his letter concerning tolerations, he actually wants to eradicate both Catholics and Muslims. He's quite clear on that. It is
Okay.
that letter is quite wild.
Yes.
It is only Protestants amongst each other can have an argument, but not with Catholics because they got the Pope.
Got you. I've been reading so much that I get my wires crossed. Which this is sort of the wiring that goes into the foundation of the nation state. And, if people think that we're in the first moment in these last decades where we are talking about politics mainly in terms of coalitions between identity groups and intersecting between this group and that group, the 19th century, the woman question, the Jewish question did not start with Hitler. The Jewish question started with enlightened liberals. The Polish question, the Hungarian question, the corn question, the slavery question, the this question, the that question, that is the prototype. And it is a response to the exclusivist, violent, genocidal nature of the nation state that's trying to not do away with the nation state. And so I end up being involved with people for years who, because even the people who say, oh, I'm anti-nationalist, it's still so conditioned by the loops around identity that are created by the prototype of the nation state, which is now trying to squish us trans people to the margins or out of existence, that all they know how to do is national liberation. I'm an ally, right? Like, I'll hold your flag. And it goes back to not knowing how to work with each other, right? So there's a whole bunch of a whole bunch of stuff, and I've talked for a long time, but I really appreciate the two of you bringing this stuff up, because it's something that I've been really gnashing my teeth on for a long time.
Yeah, thanks for this. I remember when I used to be on Facebook, we used to be Facebook friends. I had never met you, but now we did. This is nice. This was like in 2017 or something. So I like what you bring up about the national liberation model, which is hard to get rid of, right? So there is often, like in Born in Flames, Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames, which is, especially if you grew up in US or quote-unquote Western Europe, it might be a helpful film. My friends from Eastern Europe, they're extremely pissed off because she never thought about that the film would be even seen there. But she has a scene in there where three women are trying to talk to a party secretary, going like, yo, we're now after the revolution, when it's our turn, come on, we need our stuff. And the guy goes, yeah, I really understand you, so sorry. We just really have to pull together for a while and then we come to you, right? And it's one of those very, very classic scenes that she put in the film where it is unity over possibility. And I think one of the things that we put out in the book as a way to break this national or unity model, which is quite often patriarchal because it also comes with purifying and a new norm that comes out of a leadership, a very hierarchical leadership quite often, is that you need to be able to leave the collective. So leaving the collective is sometimes the best and most healthy thing you can do. One of the people I work with, Joy Mariama Smith, and we write about consent and performance and non-verbal forms of consent, so the anti-Lockean. not the contractual waffling, but so what does your body do? Where do you position yourself in space? How do you move through space? How do you work through the concept? Ade is very adamant about the generative power of no. And I think in those moments when you get this fake solidarity, the refusing of it is very strong, especially if you do it in people's face, because it's probably one of the most generous things you can do to this person or to this group. And that helps people quite often to rethink, I would say, as one of the tools. When you cannot leave, for instance, an institution because you're dependent on it, in order to pay your rent, you need to go to work. You know, that's why work is involuntary. Then this power of no is quite often absent, right? The only thing we can do is then only as union organizers try to go on strike, try to do these kind of things. But it's quite a hard tool already. In collectives, the leaving is one of the strongest things you can do. Sometimes when the co-op where we were living in, when that fell apart, we all took our knowledge and we started new things. And all that knowledge that we brought along was very, very helpful to fertilize this new co-op. So sometimes it is better not to make a huge mass movement because the price is often hierarchy. It is better to have small movements and try to figure out how you can occasionally come together or not. You know?
Maybe I'll try and comment from another angle a little bit. I'll keep it short, so if somebody else wants to come in, we can have more questions. One of the things, so it's interesting because it's like, does the national liberation movement turn into the local, right? And the local is the possibility of organizing, or is the space where things can emerge, or where things can be articulated, or where things can happen, maybe. And one of the other things that we were talking a little bit about this already, but one of the things that that comes up, that we write about quite extensively, is this question of friction, and is this flip of, on the one hand, frictions in collectives is good. We've been talking about that. On the flip side is that friction at this kind of the neoliberal management approach to the world, which includes the let's have everyone in a box so HR can function, so they can have automated AI HR. You can just scan your documents, it's fine. They check if you're real or not. Turns out you're not real, bad luck. But next to that is that the management, this kind of neoliberal structure is trying to operate for a frictionlessness, right? And for them also, we were saying this other side is when people turn up in the collective, it's good, right? But when people don't turn up for management, that's good for management, right? So that means the things are working well, because they're great, nobody's shown up for the election, brilliant. No, uncontested, let's go. And there's a drive for frictionlessness, which is always also the thing that teaches us to not be engaged in friction, to be fine, let's be conflict averse. Let's let things roll. Let's let the system oil itself, even though we're the people putting the oil in or whatever. I don't know if I've got anything more helpful to say to add to what Maker's comment, but so I'm going to hand it back if anyone's got more questions. Yeah. Well, you got to wait for the mic, but over here. Because we can just talk for hours, so hour 3 of the podcast. Hi.
Hello. I hope this isn't too long-winded, but essentially the discussion on the willingness to receive in mutual aid made me think about, I was having this conversation with one of my good friends, and he's a student at SF State University, and he was one of the main negotiators for the encampment and for divestment. And he had this kind of streak of individualism almost, where it was if I am the best negotiator, then this will all go, and if I take care of everyone else, and I take care, then nothing will need to happen, and it'll be great. And so I had this discussion with him and was giving him some advice, and I said, hey, bro, you can't give the love that you can't receive, because it's kind of trying to speak a language that you don't understand. And we had this whole long discussion about that. And he agreed with me at the end, but he didn't really have the tools to, because learning a language is hard. So like he didn't really have the tools to be like, okay, now I'm going to act in this different way. So it's easy to say, let's receive something, but what would your tips through the trans femme lens, as you've defined the terms trans and femme through this book, be to help people learn how to receive?
I think part of it is that, so we're talking about the like attentiveness, you know, as one of these kind of key things. One of the other things that comes up is like a willingness to both try things out and for also not be necessarily really good at them, to like be able to try things out and be willing to either do things badly or willing to like being cool with making mistakes, you know. And in that there's obviously a whole question around humility and whatever, which is really important. But next that is like, cool, we're not going to be the best. We don't have to be the best, you know. There's a line in one section of the book where we're like, we're simply the rest. We're not better than anyone, you know? And it's like, actually, because that's part of what we're trying to say. Well, it makes us like, everyone's a genius. It's like, no, yeah, we're simply everyone, you know? And as soon as you start feeding that ego of like, great, I'm the best negotiator ever, you're probably going to lose. I'm going to hand it to Mijke because I know where this goes.
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to talk about two different encampments in the UK. I'm not going to name them. There will be a publication out about the Student Intifada in the UK, so keep an eye on it. It's brought out by the Stuart Hall Library. And so in one of the encampments, they had a very clear aim. And the aim was, we need to get this university to divest. And so there was a negotiating team, almost like your friend. They were still a group, but they drew close together and they become closer and closer and closer. And then you're the rest of the encampment where people were doing care and cooking and doing other things and cleaning together and making posters. And they started to lose touch with the negotiators who were like super overworked. And in the end, they even didn't join the common meals anymore. And one of the reasons why this happened, because their aim was so clear, and that they were going to make the university divest. The other encampment said, like, hold on. It, in fact, maybe doesn't matter whether we get this university to divest or not. We're going to, first of all, spend time with each other to try to train each other how to be in this encampment, how to get each other to open up, to know each other, to feel with each other, to think with each other, to work with each other. And only then will we start to also do negotiating. But the encampment was always before the aim. And I think this is one of the ways to learn it, is to put the collective before your aim. Because if your aim becomes more important than the people, and this is the difference between an organization and an institution. In an institution, the institution is more important than the people in it. This is why institutions are violent. In organizations, it's the other way around. In the collective, in the organization, people are more important than the organization itself. And that is why we can learn to love and care for each other and receive it when we need it. Thanks, it's such an amazing question.
We still got time. Comments. So with that, I spend a lot of time at a bookshop in Edinburgh, and they're always like, oh no,
You got one.
yeah. I spend this time at a bookshop in Edinburgh, and they're always like, question is a single sentence with a question mark at the end. But this is comments also.
And this is somewhat related to what you both have touched on, but I'm curious if there was any kind of like further elaboration just in your own thoughts or in the book about mothers. And you talk about mothers, talking about first of all about folks who are really bad at receiving back the energy they're giving, but also this idea that they're very powerful forces within the family and such. And how do we bring in the moms, to this kind of more general collective of care you're talking about, because they're such a powerful force, and yet kind of like have that block, and it kind of also aligning to what you were mentioning, even about older women past menopause, and the relation with trans women and medical care and such. So was wondering if there's any
Yeah, thanks for this
further.
question.
Yeah.
My brain's like, the mom question. What we don't write about we don't write about mothers so much in the book. I guess we write a little bit. We spend a bit of time talking about care as a practice and thinking through what that might mean. Also, we spend a bit of time thinking about its kind of flip side, which is harm, right? And to think about these two things together. And one of my challenges in writing a chapter on care in this book was that I already wrote a chapter on care, which is in the Transgender Marxism book about queer and trans social reproduction, where I basically argue like queer and trans communities make our lives and our body minds possible, right? Which is already to kind of decenter the nuclear family as the site of reproduction. And sure, I mean, you know, we can have a whole conversation about that, but that's not the answer to the question. Because there's something in what we're trying to do is think through different forms of life and what does it mean to have a different form of world or a different space in which we exist, which is not to say or where our body, minds, and our lives and our politics and our articulations of ourselves, et cetera, all of these things become possible, which is, you know, we're obviously talking about the collective, and collectives don't necessarily have to be political collectives. They could just be, you know, they might be like gender empowerment collectives, you know, they might just be fun. It might be a football team or probably more likely a softball team, let's be honest. And that's one in Glasgow. And next to that, I mean, there's probably a football team. That might be more hierarchical. Anyways, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Because I guess there's something about the kinds of training, because Sophie Lewis talks about how the nuclear family is already a structure that's unable to meet the care needs of the people within its structure, you know, be that the kids or be that the adults or be that the people who are in elder care, right? Because all of it is still based on a localized, within a context of deprivation, as in social deprivation, right? Where care isn't subsidized, or you have to pay to have for elder care, or you have to pay for childcare. And thus that means that everyone has to work more to get the money to do those things, and that also deprives the amount of care and blah, blah, you know, and this is the thing. And next to that is, I'll try and give a practical example. So for me, one of the times where I felt I was temporarily in a care collective where, and there's maybe questions around what it means to be in a temporary care collective rather than a long-term one that's lifelong, where the division of labor is such that, okay, and then my mum ends up trying to be in this care collective, right? Because my mum turns up and she's like, oh, but you need care in this situation. It's like, no, I have these beautiful queer and trans folks looking after me. Actually, it's kind of fine. You know, we've got each other's back. And then in the next year, we'll have somebody else in the collective's back, right? And what did we do? So on the one hand, it's like the role of the mum is kind of obsolete, but then we also found her function, which is my mum's an incredible cook. So, and actually that's what everyone needed. Everyone needed a meal to help with the work, right? So it was like, there's some question about like how we restructure the position of the mother. So mothers aren't just heroes, because we can't really have heroes in the collective, right? And sure, the problem is that there are always going to be charismatic people who want to lead a collective, but then it's immediately not a collective because they've made themselves indispensable. And that's kind of the problem of the structure.
Yeah. I'm going to follow that last thing, and then I will come up with my mom in the end. So one of the things that we did as negotiators is that the negotiators, like the sort of like, you know, the frontline assembly, we were not allowed to make any decision. So we were negotiating with management, but then we went outside to our committee. We have a huge committee because we're a queer feminist committee. So like everybody comes and brings their dogs and cats and children. So we always handed our negotiations back to our strategists, and they made the decisions and sent us back to negotiate. So in order for us not to become the heroes, because one of the things, like, it doesn't matter, like, come on, I'm a Leo rising, so I really love to to shine, etc. That's fine, but I also need to be able to come down the ladder. And if I don't teach myself that, and if my friends don't help me come down the ladder, I create a problem for my friends and for me. So that is one of the things. Like we need to be able to walk down and hand the power back. Talking about my mom, yeah, my mom is fine. She's tiny, she comes still here. But one of the things that my mom is extremely good at is admiring my friends. Not so much me, but she really loves my friends. So when Lalo was in London, then my mom was like blushing with pride that she could go with Lalo to some sort of vegan burger place, like super dinky joint in Soho. And it's shining in that sense. And I think in that sense, and my mom is disabled, so from her I learned that it's important to accept care. It doesn't mean that I can do it, but at least I had a good example. And in that sense, I really like the intergenerational structure of it, because my mom was never just nuclear. She always, she comes from the Catholic South in the Netherlands, so she always had huge friend groups, and all her sisters and brothers were there, so we're like with many. We have a photo from when I was just born, and we were 220. My great-grandparents were still alive, like we're with many. So you don't do individualism in a Catholic family, you all talk at the same time, and then you hope that something gets through. So basically, if there's something that my mom taught me, it is collectivity, I think. And in that sense, and she learned it from her mom, and she learned it then again from her mom, because her mom, like my great-grandmother had 16 children, and they were designated as antisocial, but they were from the priest. They were not allowed to use anti-conception, and if they didn't make children, then the priest would also be knocking at the door and going like, where's the next kid? Come on, we need them for the church. And the other side is, of course, that then the government came around and say, like, these Catholics are antisocial people, look at them with their 16 children. And so what I learned from that lineage is, on the one hand, that my great-grandmother, who was almost illiterate, emphasized how important it is to do education. And that whole line of women has only been pushing, do education, do education, do education, do education. So in that sense, it's not just a mom, it is a lineage of people pushing for thinking together, but also, like what Anja said, the intellectual power of the working class is enormous in these generations, because intellectuality is not in academia, as my mom taught me. Intellectuality is people that do something, coming together and figuring out why their life is the way it is. And literally that is working class thinking, because academia, the bourgeoisie, is quite often just obsessed with disciplinarity.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
It's online. Don't you want to see?
Yeah, let's take a look.
We can do both. We can do both.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
You mentioned briefly about care in a system in which not everyone's needs are able to get met. And I'm curious if you can speak more about receiving care in when there is such scarcity, with like mass unemployment, very high prices. There's often these communities of care that center around people that are very vulnerable and need a high level of care. And I feel like the people that have more privilege are hesitant to ask for the support that they may need because of the limits that exist there. And so I was just curious if you have any perspective on that.
Thanks for that. I'm trying to join the threads. My brain is the slurps. It's getting late. I haven't had my dinner. There's something, so it's this mix, because also like, yeah, quite often folks who are in need of care are not good at asking for it, right? And then next to that is, because there's so much stigma around welfare or support or our needs, maybe a useful practical example is that I have so many friends in Scotland who are like, oh, you know, I only had to wait 3 years before I got referred to for this surgery. And my role in these conversations is always like, you had to wait 3 years before you got referred to the surgery, you know, so even not even surgery, it's 3 years plus to get an appointment at the gender clinic. And next to that is like, I think part of it's like, how do we show that the horizon of care can be different? And I don't want to just say it's in like an idealist, like we can provide these things ourselves, but it might be in a like how the restructuring of life is possible to make care possible, in the sense of like, because all of this is about giving some time or taking some time, you know, and sure, it's really easy to say that when it's like, you know, I think about friends who are working like 7 days a week for pittance to do the things that they want to do, you know, next to the options that are available to them, which would be to get a crap job doing something they don't want to do, you know. But then simultaneously, they may not be the best people at receiving care. And like, actually, overwork also feeds this drive of like, the overworking drive leads to the burnout because there isn't space for care. And so there are all these kind of layers in that, yeah, Mijke, do you want to say? I'm going to keep thinking.
Yeah, and then we can come back to you and you finish it. So I think one of the things that I already talked a bit about it, like climbing down a ladder. So I think people that are privileged in an unfortunate position to grow up in sort of quote unquote privileged, they often are very bad at being in relation, because you only get power by disconnecting from relation. Right? So people that are there, they need to understand themselves, often, hopefully with help of a collective, that they need to learn to calm down and be in actual relation with people. It's difficult, but they need to learn that. And they often don't know that they need to learn that. So that is my first answer there. I think a second answer there, and that goes also back to the mom, like one of the people, of the theories that I find really helpful in this sense is Maria Lugones, who writes about her mom. And she is like, oh yeah, I learned to graft my substance on my mom, like that kind of care that you just take without looking, right? That take without acknowledging. And so she always looked down on her mom a bit, because she also couldn't see how her mom was resisting and how her mom made things in a way that it worked for her, or that she could do it in a way that was helpful for her. And so Maria Lugones talks about her own climbing down the ladder and taking people seriously. And I think once you start taking people directly seriously, you also bestow them immediately with accountability. And that is not the same seriously as the up the hierarchy privilege. That is often like the voice that you cannot evade. But if you take somebody seriously, even if they're up the ladder, then they still suddenly need to have accountability. And the ladder exists to avoid accountability. Because that is what institutions do, and that is what institutionalized power does. It shields people with power, with the help of policy, from accountability. But it also means, like, I don't take that manager seriously, because they're just over there. But when I do, then they become accountable, but also I become accountable. And it's a whole different story then. And in these difficult moments, it's the same answer actually I gave you. This generative no is very important in that, because that is the moment that you look each other in the eye and you're willing to fight for it. But it also means you don't give up on somebody else. And if we're going to undo this world into something else, we cannot give up on people, even if we don't like them.
There's still something in there about the relationship of all of this thinking to the privatized care sector, and I'm trying to think through, like, I don't think I can give you an answer in like 3 minutes or whatever, but the next to that is this, I mean, like, I'm like, the, you know, privatized abstract care sector of Heinies, and then I'm like, actually the flip side is that so much of our thinking around care, and I say like ours, and I'm thinking about like this is a thing in transboxism more broadly as well, emerges because we know so many people who are carers who are doing that. Often I think about the folks in my carpool, right, who are like in their early 20s, who are doing care labor as their job on the side of their education, and partly because there's something around care, this form of like precarious care work is by no means unskilled, right? Even though it's kind of considered to be unskilled, it's actually highly skilled and highly thoughtful, and there are whole questions around engagements and approaches and understandings that emerge. And I wonder if there's, I really hope some more people do some research on this around like LGBT care workers, especially LGBT youth, because there's something in there that's still kind of unthought through. Like, I don't want to say unthought through, but unaccounted for. This maybe.
Yeah, cool. So
I think we're nearly at time. We are at time.
Thank you both for being here, and thanks to Pluto Press for having the courage to produce this book, and James Tracy, thank you for making the connection.
Thanks, James.
And I'm
thanks,
so glad
Lolly,
you
also
managed
for
to make it out
hosting
here.
here.
It means so much to us. And thanks
Thank
to
you
all
for
of you for
having
joining
us.
us tonight. And to those of you online as well,